Sorry about that. I just had to get my notes. Wow, thank you all for coming to iGUIDE Masterclass number 3. Who knew we'd make it this far? You may have already noticed that in the chat there's a link. So what we're trying is a little bit different this week. We're putting a link to a small survey in the chat, and if you'd fill it out, we would be very thankful because we're looking for feedback about these webinars and some other stuff. And if you would provide that, that would be awesome. We'll probably do lots more of these webinars if there's interest, and we would just like to know, what you're interested in. Please save all your questions. I'll answer them all at the end. I'm going to talk for probably around 30 minutes, and then after that, I'll start sifting through the chat, and I'll answer any questions in there that make sense. Hopefully they're about the topic, but if they're not, that's cool. I'll answer them anyway. Next week's webinar, I just want to mention, is going to be about getting started with the iGUIDE camera, and it's going to be for newbies. So we're going to try more targeted content like that. That's for maybe very specific things, or new people, or people who have got needs and they're in different places in their iGUIDE journey, if that makes any sense. So get your feedback in now, because we'll take that into account when we decide what webinars to do. But next week's will be for new people. It'll be about kind of getting started. So today the topic is, there's 3 sort of parts to this. It's shooting large spaces, and then I'm going to talk about shooting spaces that you don't want to have drafted, and then I'm also going to talk about Google Street View export, and all those things are kind of related. So shooting large spaces is often, office buildings and warehouses and stuff. A lot of that stuff can translate, if they're businesses, to Google Street View, and often they have places within them that you don't necessarily want to have drafted. You just want to show them without a floor plan. So I'm going to show you sort of how to do that and describe why you would do that. So why don't we dig in and start talking about large spaces. So I'm going to load up my demo. I've got a few large spaces here, and I'm going to walk you through some tips. So what I want to say, I guess, to start is that shooting large spaces is exactly like shooting small spaces. They're just bigger. I know that sounds really obvious, but using the iGUIDE camera, it's just the same procedure over and over. Shoot a pano and line up your data, and then shoot a pano and align your data. You might have a slightly different workflow, and that's fine, but more or less it's going to be the same for a big space, just the same as it is for a small space, except you're going to do the capturing the pano and aligning data for more often and for longer periods of time. So I'll give you a few examples. We've done some bigger commercial buildings that are sort of 10 to 20,000 square feet. I've done like a hospital that was close to 300,000 square feet, and they don't differ in any way from a small property in the sense that they can be just as complex. They can have big open spaces. That's actually the biggest difference, if I'm going to point one out. But really, homes can have that too. They just mean you have to create panos for a longer period of time. You create more of them. So in general, as if I'm going to sort of break this down into a series of things or tips, my first tip would be to follow a logical sequence. So this sounds really obvious, like of course you would, right? But in bigger spaces, it matters more because you can move further away from where you're shooting and confuse yourself. So I'll explain. So the camera system is, it's non-linear, and all of you, I'm sure, already know this. You can go wherever you want, and you can shoot wherever you like, and the camera's not going to stop you. But it helps if you shoot in a logical sequence and you don't stray too far from your previous panorama. So often with these bigger properties, there are special considerations. There's someone who has a key, and they can only give you access to some part of the building. So sometimes you'll get called away to do different parts at different times. And if you do that, there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. It's totally fine. But if you do that, you run the risk of not having data be connectable later. So I'll tell you how to deal with that. But in general, follow a logical sequence and go, pano by pano, room by room, and make sure that you've sort of got everything covered. So if you can, I don't know if you guys can see this really clearly. Let me zoom in. If you can see the data that I've got on screen here, I'm going to show you the sequence that I went. So this is a hospital. This is a giant space that's super confusing, and I didn't align the data very well, and that's why it's so sloppy. Don't tell the drafters. So I want you to watch the sequence. So you can see that the panorama that I've highlighted is down here. So I guess I started there in the corner. It kind of makes sense. I picked a starting point from which to begin, and I sort of move. So you can see as I move my cursor, it shows you the order that I went in. I kind of went out to the hallway there, and I started moving through the hallway, and I shot it, just like you would a house. Shooting corridors and then going and getting rooms and backtracking if required. The only difference is that I kept going. So there's lots of different ways to do this. So my recommendation would be don't necessarily, unless this works for you, in which case that's fine. There's nothing wrong with this, but don't shoot large sections and then add on to it. Go piece by piece, room by room, and don't stray too far. That's my recommendation from experience. So what I mean by that is you could shoot the entire, corridor. For example, in this property, the whole sort of corridor, and then you could have gone back and backfilled all the rooms off of it. That would have been fine. You could do that. But I don't like to work that way. I prefer to go sort of piece by piece. What will happen if you start to build and grow your data is that you will eventually hit the limit of what your canvas can show. So this happens to everybody at some point, and it happens with houses as well, just big houses. And the way that you accommodate for that is you've got two options. In the survey interface, you can tap on the Map Actions button and choose Grow Canvas, and that will give you a bigger canvas within which to work. So that's solution number one. Solution number two is to choose the other option that's there, Center the Data. So all that does is take all the data that you've captured and just move it to the middle of your screen. Both of those options work fine. The way I would usually do it, from my experience, is that I would collect data, usually starting, off to the side, somewhere in a corner. So if you do that, it starts in the middle of the canvas and it will work toward the edge, so you'll hit it pretty quick. So what I'll do is I'll keep recentering the map rather than growing it. The performance is slightly better, in my opinion, if you haven't grown the map. The resolution is slightly higher, so I prefer to work that way. And then what I'll do is I'll wait till the very last second, and then I'll grow the map when I need to, rather than just grow it and grow it and grow it, rather than recenter the data. So the reason I like to do it that way is that when you begin to grow the map and it starts to get bigger and bigger, it's kind of hard to see exactly what it is that you're looking at. I find that I struggle a little bit. Basically, there's one other option that you have too if you want to use it. So normally I wouldn't recommend this, but it can sometimes be helpful for larger properties. When you're shooting a typical house, you typically shoot your first pano and you don't touch it. You just leave it in place. And then you walk to another location and you shoot a second and you align it to your first. And what happens is that the compass in the camera will do most of the heavy lifting for you. It will rotate the data to more or less the same rotation as the previous pano, so that you don't have to do much rotation. It's doing most of it for you. So you just have to move the data a little bit. But sometimes with bigger properties, because they're so just humongous, it can actually be helpful to align your very first pano and square it to the bottom of the screen. So if you do that, you have to then align every subsequent pano so that you have to do the exact same rotation to every following pano that you've done. So normally that hinders more than it helps, but in a big property that can actually be sort of helpful, especially when you're trying to keep track of giant rectangles. And most of these buildings are literally giant rectangles. One of the nice things that you might be able to do too, this happens quite frequently, and you might not be lucky enough to get a floor plan ahead of time, but if you do get a floor plan ahead of time, a lot of these buildings, they're big commercial buildings, they already have floor plans, so sometimes they'll hand you one before you capture the data. What you can use, you can map out your route through the space, and you can even use it as a time management tool. So this doesn't always actually work, but I have tried it a few times, and it's sort of effective. You can take the floor plan and draw or count how many spaces you're going to need panos in, draw your route, and just kind of plan it out, and then count the number of panos and multiply that by about a minute. So if you've got 60 panos, about 60 minutes usually is about right. So that's kind of nice for quoting, how long it's going to take you to do the job. So the two biggest questions that I get about properties, like big properties, like warehouses, things that are humongous, that have big open spaces, are how far apart should my panos be and how many do I need? So in a space like you can see on screen here, well, you need one per space. It's just like a house. I've got another one here. But in this one here, you can see this is a big open space. So how many panos you need? Well, you need enough to measure the space, but you also need enough to visually communicate that space for your client. So it kind of depends on what your client's looking for. If they just want floor plans, it doesn't really matter as much. But when you're communicating the space for the first purpose, for drafting to create floor plans, you need to be able to get the laser measurements, and you need to be able to depict things visually or show them in the images that the drafters have to draw in. So that's like windows and doors and features. So what that means is while you're shooting, you need to just keep in mind that you may need to create panels in locations just so the drafters can see things. So you might have the laser measurement data or enough, so this entire room, I probably could have done it in like 2 panels if I really wanted to. Let's see. No, I guess not. It's pretty big. But how many did I do it in? 6? 3, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, well, I mean, that's fair. When the drafts people are drawing in things like windows, they need a good view because they have to line up either side of the window in order to properly, accurately draw it in. So that means that panos in front of windows are quite handy, and panos off to the side, where it's at an extreme angle, are not great because it's much harder for them to figure out where the windows start and stop. But in general, the frequency of panos is going to be determined by sort of like the size of the space and how much data you're capturing as you're moving from position to position. So what I mean by that is you're going to shoot a panorama and you're going to look at what you've got, and then you're going to find some kind of identifying marker where you have captured data. So I'll give you an example. It would be, say, this column here that you can kind of see, this column. So in this panorama, I clearly have captured this column. So then what I would do is when I move to this panorama or the next location, I would just be aware that I need to also capture that column. If you keep details that will appear in the laser measurement data in common from pano to pano, position to position, you're fine. That's what you really need. And then, as an aside, bear in mind the drafters have to draw features. So if they can't see them, you're going to have to capture extra panos so that they can. So that's doors and windows and fixtures. The other question, well, another side question that I get a lot about large spaces is, do I need to do outdoor panos? And the answer is always no. There's never a need for outdoor panos, but they're fine. You can do as many as you like. There's no limit to outdoor panos. So if you want to include a series of panoramas outside of the building, go right ahead. That could have value to your client for visually, inspecting an exterior or something like that, but they're not used for measurement in any way. So they're not necessary. But you can capture outdoor panos so quickly. I shot a grocery store and I shot the entire perimeter, maybe 20 panos, maybe 10 minutes. Like I turned the HDR off and I just moved really fast. And they seemed quite pleased. They quite liked it. All right, we're going to move on now to a sort of side topic, and that's shooting spaces that you don't want drafted. So these are, and the reason it's kind of related is that these are often very large spaces, like, weird stuff like garages and barns and things that are detached from homes. So if you're doing a regular, we'll say just residential house, and you're creating an iGUIDE and you want everything, you want the floor plans, you want, the full 3D tour, but then it has some weird outbuilding and you want to show that on the listing, but you don't want to have to basically pay to have a giant rectangle drafted. What you can do is you can just capture it without the laser measurement data, and you can send it to us in a way that communicates to us that you don't want it drafted, you just want it shown. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of that I've loaded up. This is also used for common areas in things like apartment buildings or condos. So often they have no data, they're not associated with the unit in any way. It's like a pool room or a movie room or a workout room or whatever, and they're off somewhere else. But you want to show them the amenities are interesting and they're valuable to the listing. So the way you capture those is that you go and you create your 360s, but you basically don't capture measurements, and that's just done by turning the laser off. It's that simple. You just turn the laser off. When you turn the laser off, it's going to warn you on the camera. It's going to say, "Hey, are you sure you want to do this?" And you just say, "Yes, I do." So with the laser off, what will happen is that you'll capture your images just like you would normally, but there will be no laser measurement data to speak of. And that's a good thing because then the drafters can't draw it. The best way to communicate that you want those things just on the floor plan, or not on the floor plan, sorry, on the iGUIDE, but you don't want them drawn, is to put them on a separate floor and call them what they are. So in the case of a condo, you'd say, amenities, in the case of, or a common area, something like that. If you want to do a lot of exterior panoramas that have nothing to do with the structure. So for example, there's a cottage, but then you want to capture some 360s down on the dock, it's nowhere near the property. Then you could go down and you could create a series of panoramas on the dock. But large spaces are the same. So let's suppose there's a barn on the property. You could go into the barn, capture all the panoramas you want, and then put them, and then don't turn the lasers on, make sure they're off. And then when you go, when you create a floor, you just call it barn. The drafters will see that and they will label the floor barn. And then you won't get dinged for drafting a giant space. So when I say floor, what I mean is they'll appear on the floor selector. So when you have your iGUIDE, you'll have actually, I'll show you. Sorry, I have a demo. There we go. So here's a great example. So here's a property. I think it's in Calgary, yeah. So here's the interior of the property. But if I go to the floor selector, I can choose one of these two options, and it will load up this. So this is going to be a list of thumbnail images if it ever appears. There we go. So there's only one, but there can be a list of a whole bunch. And basically, you can show all sorts of stuff, outdoor things, common areas, all sorts of stuff. I just saw a question pop up. Yeah, max distance between panos. There's no right answer. You need to keep details in between from pano to pano. And basically you need to make sure you get the details that drafters need to draw things. So the max distance, it's up to you, but you're not going to be able to exceed 10 meters. I mean, I guess you technically could occasionally, but for the most part that won't work because the range of the laser is about 10 meters. So you would be cutting it really close at that point. All right, so perfect. Okay, so now we're going to move on to Google Street View. How are we doing for time? Okay, we're good. 10 minutes. So Google Street View is related to this, shooting the large spaces, because basically a lot of these large spaces have public areas that you can export to Google. So I just want to start talking about Google Street View because it's a big topic. I'm going to gloss over it. You're going to ask a lot of questions. I already know. Google Street View is for public spaces only. I just want to get that out there. So it's not for residential properties or private properties. It's only for businesses or things that are accessible to the public. So it might be rental spaces, might be a kind of something that's sort of similar to residential, but is still publicly available. But that's it. So regular houses, don't worry about it. So Google Street View is free right now. So that's kind of cool. So if you want to, you can find a business. They're all empty right now for the most part to shoot, to give it a try. And just so you know, in order to turn Google Street View on, you have to choose when you create the iGUIDE to enable it by clicking the checkbox. But if you forget, no big deal. You can always go to packages and add-ons on the portal, and there's a checkbox there as well. So you can enable it when you create the iGUIDE, or no problem, you can enable it later after the iGUIDE's created. But I'm going to walk you through the process of doing Google Street View. So if you've already done it, this will be a good refresh. If you've never done it before, you're going to see how easy it is. It's very easy. Shooting a property that you're going to export to Google Street View is exactly like shooting a regular iGUIDE. There are very few differences, a few tiny ones, but for the most part, you just go out and you shoot it and you submit it, just like you would a regular iGUIDE. And then after it's processed, you can then export whatever you choose to export to Google. So this basically is just a fancy way of saying you pick some of the panos and you say to Google, okay, here, I'm sending these ones over. And Google says, okay. So the only catch, but it's not even a catch, it's a good thing. The only thing you have to think about when you're shooting Google Street View is that all of the panoramas need to be continuous and kind of like attached. So what I mean by that is you can't have places on a property that are separated unless they're separate floors. So I'm going to give you a few examples. So you're doing a chiropractic clinic and you shoot the lobby. So if you walk, 50 feet down a hallway and shoot one of the rooms that they have there, um, and they're not connected, that won't work. That doesn't make sense to the drafters. So your question might be, well, does that mean I don't have to shoot the whole property? And the answer is yes. That is another thing with Google Street View. That's quite cool. You don't have to shoot the whole thing. You can shoot whatever you want to export to Google, and that's it. The catch there is that that will break all of the floor plan calculations. So that means that you're not making complete floor plans. And they, in fact, will make no sense. But the reason they have to be continuous is that when the drafters present you with the iGUIDE, you need to have a floor plan on which the panoramas are exported. So I'm going to show you in a second what this all means, because I'm probably rambling, but the panoramas need to be continuous. So in that scenario I mentioned where you have a lobby and then there's like a long hallway and then you have a waiting room, what you would be required to do is shoot panoramas down that hallway and then into that other room so that they're all connected. So the data all makes sense and it's all connected together. You don't have to shoot all of the rooms to either side on the hallway as you walk past them, but you need to get the hallway that connects to that final room. So I'm going to load up a property that I have already exported to Street View. It's the driving school across from our office. I never thought I would miss our office. I do. Working from home is nice, but it's also nice to leave home. Just going to say that. So when you create an iGUIDE and you've enabled Google Street View, you're going to have this little button down here that says Street View. So this is where you find it. It'll be over here on the left. That's kind of where everything ends up. When you click it, you're going to go to the interface. So you can see here, I've already actually exported this to Street View. So just for kicks, I'm going to delete it and we're going to export it right now. And you can see how fast it is. So if I click delete, oh, it's going to make me sign in, is it? All right, nobody look at my password. Okay, let me do it, cool. Actually, I guess it doesn't really matter. Here, let's check. I'm going to reload. There we go, it's gone. All right, I guess I'm just going to do it again. That's fine. So in order to export, you click this new project button, and you're going to go into the Google Street View exporter. So this is a little web interface that you can use to export to Google. There's a few tools here. I'll walk you through them. You have to read this text every single time, fully. There's a quiz at the end. So I'm going to click Start and go to the first interface. So this shows me the driving school, and I can click on all the panos if I want. But here's where I choose what I want to export. So you can export multiple floors and any panoramas you wish. So what I mean by that is if you shoot 20 panoramas and you decide, oh, I only really want to send 5 to Google, well, that's fine. Go ahead, just pick 5. So in this case, I want to export them all, but I'm going to pick a few that I don't want to export. So if I double click on this, it will disable the panorama and then that won't be exported to Google. So that's what that means. So I can also disable the entire floor if I wanted to, but I'm obviously not going to do that because there's only one floor. So what you could do is you could shoot, so there's a few options here. You could shoot the entire property for floor plans, and then you could, in this interface, disable things that you don't want sent to Google. So for example, like maybe the bathrooms or storage rooms or whatever. So just like with a regular iGUIDE, you have full and complete control over what people see and what they don't see. In this scenario, you have full control over what you send and what you don't send. And the really nice thing is that if you make a mistake, by accident send the wrong stuff, no big deal. You can always delete it and then re-export it as many times as you want. That never gets locked down. You can go back and change it whenever you want to. So that looks good, so we'll keep that. So I'm going to scroll down here. I probably should have picked a property with more than one floor, but I didn't have one. But if there were more than one, you can move them up and down. The Google Street View interface has a little, like an elevator. It's like a floor selector, so you can technically have multiple floors on top of each other, and that floor selector will allow you to move between them. Here you can select what the default floor is, or the ground floor, and then you can technically click and drag and move the floors up and down to correspond to their actual levels. So that number 2 corresponds to the second floor, and the basement's below the first floor, and so on. So that's fine. We don't have to change that. But here's the cool part. Okay, so this is the reason you need a floor plan. So I have to hit Control, apparently. There we go. So now the only tricky part here with the whole system is that I need to put these panoramas onto Google Maps in their correct location. So this sometimes requires a little trial and error, and you have to sort of think about it. But when I'm looking at Google Maps, I know that the driving school is over here, and I know that the door goes through a hallway that's in the middle of this building. Now, I don't know how easy this is to see on your screens, but this is the office building, this rectangle right here. So you're going to have to find the corresponding rectangle for your particular business. And then you're going to have to kind of figure out where it goes. It's not super fussy. If you put it in the wrong spot, it's not really a big deal. So don't worry too much about it. But you want it to be approximate, because when you load up the property later on Google Street View, which I could probably do since I didn't delete it, what will happen is that there will be a little submap where all those dots are actually in their relative location. So it does matter where you put it, kind of, but it'll let you export no matter where you put them. So it's not going to break anything if you mess it up. So that's exactly where it goes. It goes right here. So I'm just going to leave it there, and I'm going to scroll down to the next step. This is where you have to choose the business. So one of the challenges that you could face if you were to offer to do this service for someone, export their business to Google Street View, is they may not have a place ID, so they'll have to make one. So it's a good idea to get them to make one before you go out and shoot it, because you won't be able to export unless you do. So I don't actually see it coming up, so I'm going to just search for Encore Records and hope it comes up. There you go, Encore Records Limited, awesome. So I'm going to click it, and now that I've selected it, I'm going to go down to the final step, and it's asking me to sign in. So I'm not actually going to export this, but if I sign in with Google and I click export, it will go back to the previous page, which is, I believe, this one if it loads. Nope, wrong one. This one. There you go. And it will give me the progress. Oh, it says deleting panels. That's fair. You probably, all of you probably already knew that. So I'm not going to mess with it. But basically now on Google Street View, if I were to click export, it would have some of the panos available. And the funny thing about Google is that when you export data to them, it takes like a month of Sundays sometimes to get up and running and connected in a coherent way. And we can't predict when that will be. So just to give you a sense of timelines, you can click the export button and have the data up and navigable in like 5 minutes. It's crazy. And there's other times where you can export it and it won't be navigable for like 3 days. So you have to set that expectation with your clients that, yeah, you're going to put it on Google for them and they'll be able to see it on their Place ID, but they won't necessarily be able to see it in its full connected form right away. Sometimes it takes a little bit. And I don't know why that is. Nobody does. It's a Google thing. So I'm going to start answering questions now. Oh, Rimi's here. Yeah, I used your property for a demo, buddy. Thanks. So I'm going to start at the beginning.
Chris, did you want me to go through the questions?
Yeah, if you want to read them to me, I'll just answer them if you want.
Okay. So Leroy has a couple of questions at the beginning to start. So he says, when you were going through the shooting large spaces, he says, do you use Automap at all? And what are the pros and cons for large spaces like this one?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. I actually forgot like a key tip, so that's excellent that we're coming back to that. So Automap, nope, no, never use it. Automap is can be useful if you find it useful, but at the end of the day, there's a very good reason why I don't use it. So big spaces take sometimes a lot of time. They can take hours. The hospital that we shot took three days continuous. It was crazy. So spending the extra effort to do the Automap where I know I won't need it just seems silly. I just won't do it. The Automap has value to those who like using it. So if you like it, then go ahead. But I can't even imagine what it would be like to walk through a really giant space and try to use Automap. I'll give you 2 examples of where it will epically fail. So if you have a really, really large room, I did one once that was 13,000 square feet, one room, and the Automap can't see the other side of the room. So as you're walking out into the center of the space, it gets lost because it just has no data to see. So that's one area where it fails. The other one is that as you walk through the space, especially office buildings, they have very similar sort of spaces that have like little, square rooms, So the Automap can sometimes get confused, again, because all the spaces are so similar. It might think it's where it's not. So because the properties are much larger, that often means that there's a far higher likelihood through the much longer process of automapping that it will get messed up. But the tip that I missed earlier is that typically when you're shooting a property for real estate, you always point the camera in the same in the direction of something important to start, because that's relevant to a real estate tour. You don't want the tour or the panorama starting on a blank wall. You want it to, when it loads up, to show something nice, like a fireplace or a staircase or whatever. So in a bigger space, like a commercial building or even a business sometimes, or a warehouse, there's nothing. It doesn't matter. So you can point the camera wherever you want. So sometimes it's a great idea just to always point the camera in one direction, whatever makes sense for you. So if it's always toward the back wall or whatever, that's cool. And that just kind of helps you keep track of if your panoramas are aligned, because when you're shooting and you look at the survey interface, there's a little orange arrow that points forward, and that orange arrow will always be pointing in the same direction. And that's why the orange line or that one orange line is there, because I shot a giant mega building that had literally nothing in it. It was empty except for columns, and every panorama looked the same. So it was really hard to keep track of what orientation they have, because if you rotate it 90 degrees, it's the same, the data is the same. So if that line was more clearly visible, it was easier. So they made it orange for that reason. So you're welcome. Next question.
So another one from Leroy. Can you talk about the usage case that you present to organizations and businesses like the hospital you mentioned? What strategies do you suggest to go about landing large shoots like these?
Holy smokes, that's an amazing question. So I'll be honest, I can't answer that. That's its own webinar, basically, Leroy. So sorry. But that's a great suggestion for a future webinar. Bidding on large projects like that can be very complicated. And it's not as simple as just going into a room and pitching it to people and telling them what the benefits are. You have to really understand what it is that they want to do with the technology. Like, what are they looking for? If it's really cut and dry, like they're really interested in something like floor planning, like they want to know the square footage of a space for some reason, even that alone is complicated because there's different ways of calculating square footage. So if they want something like BOMA calculations, you're going to have to take a few extra steps. But we'll make a note, and I will totally drag someone else into a webinar to address that at some point.
Yeah, so another question, probably we'll have to add to that kind of line of thought, but George says, I am with Leroy on that, have had interest, but the invoicing is a challenge for the customer usually.
Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, just with the large spaces and knowing what the right amount per square footage is. So we'll just add that to our notes for whenever if there's enough interest, and maybe putting some stuff together for that. Al says, what is the max distance between panos? 10 meters?
Yeah, I already addressed it, but I'll say it again because everyone always asks this just constantly. There's no way for me to specifically say what the max distance is, because there are lots of factors at play here. So I'll give you an example. The range of the laser is about 30 feet, 10 meters. But it's not really. It's actually somewhere between like 25 and 45. Like, it's all over the place. So I did a big warehouse once, and all the walls were painted black up like 6 feet. So the range of the laser dropped to like 15 feet. It was crazy. So I tried doing that. I tried capturing it anyway for quite a while, but then we gave up. And Alex actually brought out one of the rolling dollies that we have, and I was able to raise the camera up above that weird black layer. I don't know why they did that, but so it's kind of hard to say a precise max distance. If I were to just to ballpark it, you want to keep it between sort of usually 15 and 20 feet. And that really has to do with keeping details in common from one pano to the next. It's not any hard figure that's like you can measure out or anything.
Okay. Remy says, if a client doesn't want measurements done for a large space, i.e. VR or photos only, is that an option, and does it affect pricing?
It does. So if you're going to do a large space and you want to create something that's far more visual, my recommendation would be to ask us about it before you do it.
So yeah,
because we could probably we could quote you in a different way, so you don't get dinged for like a ridiculous giant rectangle where you just really wanted the panos and the square footage is irrelevant. So I'm going to say call in and consult with us. Send an email to me or Michael or the drafting team and just ask. Say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this property. Here it is on Google Maps. This is what I'm trying to create. And that goes for really any large space. So if you're going to do something, and they're all weird. I was going to say, if you're going to do something weird, they're all kind of strange. I'll give you some examples. Baseball stadium, hockey arena. If you're going to do a greenhouse, or you're going to do, an underground bunker, anything really strange, just email us first and say, hey, what do you guys think about this? Because we might be able to give you some insight that will save you some time and some money, And we want to be able to make sure that you meet the expectations of your clients, whatever those are.
Awesome. Okay. George says, big challenge that I have had when using Stitch for some of these large places that I have done. The Stitch auto functions break the places up completely, so you end up having to put the building back together like a puzzle. I recommend not using the auto function unless Chris has a better suggestion.
I
Okay,
totally
so that
agree.
wasn't really a question.
Yeah,
But yeah.
forget the auto alignment stuff just falls apart when you get into these giant spaces because they have rooms that are similarly sized. Like I gave an example of an office building the other day. You'll have like, 25 10 by 10 rooms, and the software cannot figure out the difference. It thinks they're all the same room. So it gets very confused. So don't rely on auto at all. Your best bet to get your data to be well aligned and to make sense from start to finish while you're shooting and after is to align it as you go and as best you can, and follow a logical sequence through the property, like something that you yourself can identify. So just to give you another example, when we did the hospital, we actually had to break it up because it was so big. So I took half, and Josh, who's shooting with me, he took the other half. And what we did is we had floor plans of the space already, and we just marked off the spaces as we went through them. That's a bit weird to actually have the floor plans. That hasn't really happened to me before that, but it was very convenient. The other thing that it's a good idea to do is to break up large spaces in obvious grids. So if you have a giant, 40,000 square foot warehouse, you wouldn't just randomly sprinkle your panos throughout it, right? You go in like a sequence, you go in a line, and then you turn around and you do another line, and you would sort of, it's like mowing the lawn, right? Like you're going to go through the entire space bit by bit. And that's for two reasons. One being that you're capturing the data from the whole space, and the other is that you're trying to communicate to your client whatever it is that they want to see, visually in the images. So that could be in the middle of the space. And the reason I say that is, technically speaking, if it's a giant open mega warehouse and you want a floor plan, you could actually go all the way around the perimeter and capture that. Now, it's unlikely that you're going to have a giant mega warehouse that has nothing in the middle to measure, but if that happens, then yeah, technically you could go around the perimeter and capture your panos. I did a trade show, and there was like a trade show floor in Orlando, and there was very little structure in the center of that building. It was like a giant airplane hangar. And so really all you could do was go around the perimeter to get kind of like a something that would resemble a floor plan. Then I went and I just backfilled it with panos that I thought were fun, just sort of interesting things to look at because there was no data to speak of. There were like, booths and people and stuff. That was 230,000 square feet. That was crazy. Okay, I hope that answers your question. But yeah, so just to summarize, yeah, the auto alignment just falls apart when you have giant spaces. You're kind of on your own there.
Okay, Al says, what are some examples of time taken to scan a large space, 10,000 square foot per hour? Factors that affect time taken?
Oh, that's a super good question. Okay, so what matters when you're capturing any space, especially big ones, is complexity, not size. So if you've got, so I'll give you a couple examples. I measured a 13,000 square foot event space, like with 3 panos. I created extra panos just for fun because I'd driven all the way out there. But the hospital that we did took 3 solid days, and the difference is in the complexity. Hospitals are tiny, tiny little hallways, little tiny rooms. Every room had a bathroom. They'd have little nurses' lounges with a corridor, and they'd have little breakout rooms. So that just took a really long time. The 170,000 square foot warehouse that I shot took 2 hours. That was crazy. So it's the complexity that matters. So when you're trying to figure out how long it's going to take you, that's why I mentioned earlier. I probably didn't make it very clear. So I mentioned earlier, you should plan the space if you want to figure out the amount of time, and you plan it by number of panos. So if you look at a space, even just on Google Maps, you could do this. You could look at the space and you could say, okay, look, I got a big building here. This, if you can get some extra data, that's great. This area is open. This area is offices. If you can estimate the number of panos, multiply it by about a minute, that's about the amount of time it's going to take you. Sometimes it's a lot less. Sometimes it's a lot more. It has a lot to do with how fast you can move as well, and interruptions. Often what happens, and again, this is little houses and big giant mega properties, it's not the technology that will slow you down or give you an indication of how long it's going to take you. because a panorama takes 16 seconds. If you just multiply that by 100, well, that's not very long, right? But 100 panoramas is a big property. What takes the time is the property. That's the challenge. You're going to have people there who like you need to get access to spaces and they have to get you keys and you're going to have like forklifts going through and you're going to have office furniture getting in your way and there will be a lot of stuff. So the only way to really get a handle on that kind of stuff is planning. So that's scouting out the place ahead of time. That's great if you can do that. Really getting everyone who has those keys, who has access to the space, get them all on board so they're there when you're there, so that there's no space where there's like a locked door and you have to stand outside it for 30 minutes waiting for someone to show up with a key. So planning ahead, it's going to save you the most time on that one. Okay, that was a bit of a ramble. Hope I answered that question.
Leroy is very thankful for your answers.
Oh, I got a smiley face.
Tammy,
thank you, Leroy.
yeah. Tammy's asking, can we add a still photo into a business tour? For example, menu or services that can be viewed on that tour.
Sorry, I completely missed that. Can you read that to me again? It cut out for some reason.
Can we add a still photo into a business tour? For example, menu or services that can be viewed on the tour.
Sure. Adding a still photo, like where exactly, is my question. So, I mean, yeah, you can add still photos into. Oh, do you mean to Google? Yeah, I need clarification on that. If you mean adding a still photo into.
Yeah, Tammy, let us know what. Give us a little bit more info on what you're looking for, so that we can clarify.
I'm just going to assume that's what you're talking about. So the answer is you can add those anytime you want outside of us that have nothing to do with us. So when I go and I shoot,
yes to Google.
Okay, perfect. So when I add Google Street View content, like when I upload or export to Google, what I often do is I bring my regular camera and I take some pictures of the property. Most of the content that's going on, like people's Google Place IDs, it's just garbage. It's like done with cell phones and it looks like crap. So you as professional photographers have like amazing gear. You can take pictures that annihilate the stuff that regular people can do. So you take your camera, you slap a 50 on there, and you shoot a few shots, at 1.8, and you take a few pictures of a menu or some of the product that they have, and then you put your wide angle on and you do a couple shots from the corners. And when you put those on Google, they like blow people's minds because they've like never seen anything like it. So, but you don't need to go through iGUIDE or Planetor to do that. You can add those directly to their Google listing anytime you want. So usually what I do is I'll add them right away because I'll have them done, and then I'll wait and export the iGUIDE once it's finished.
Awesome. Barnaby says, any idea on battery and memory card limit for large spaces, if quantifiable?
Oh, it totally is quantifiable. Great question again. So I can give you real world examples. So the system battery is obscene. It will last like 8 to 10 hours. Josh and I shot with old batteries, not even new ones, all day, like 7+ hours for 3 days straight. And I still had an hour left on the battery each day. No problem. It was fine. Like, that's crazy. I've never had another device that could do that. It's nuts. The camera battery, roll the dice on that one. So it really depends on, so if you charge it up, you should be able to get through an entire day of shooting nonstop on 1.5 batteries is my experience. So that's the DSLR battery, sorry. But it kind of depends on how old the batteries are and if they're like good or not. Like I had a couple knockoff ones and they were just garbage. They'd shoot like half the amount of time as the regular Canon ones. But in general, full day of shooting, like 8 hours, system battery, no problem. Charge it up the night before, you're good to go. Canon batteries, you probably should have 2. And then if you have 2, you can always, discharge one completely, switch, and then plug the other one in just in case.
And then memory card limit?
Right. So I've never hit the limit. So the biggest project I've ever done, it was the hospital that we did. And that was, I think, 5 gigs. And that, I mean, like a 16 gig USB drive is like nothing. So I've never been able to create more than 5 gigs worth of data in a single shoot. I mean, that's pretty unusual, shooting for 3 days straight. Yep.
Awesome. So Barnaby says thanks, and I don't have any questions left here on the chat.
I see. There's one by Fred.
At the very beginning?
No, it's right here. I'll just answer. It's okay. In a home, for example, do kitchen appliances islands mess up the Automap? The Automap everyone always asks about Automap. I'm going to do a whole webinar on auto mapping, I think. So this will be the last thing before we go. And I mentioned the survey again. So Automap mode will go completely nuts if you change what it's looking at dramatically. So I'll give you an example. You're walking through a space and you lower the camera, and whatever the camera sees is drastically different than what it was seeing. So a kitchen is a great example. I think you even mentioned that, Fred. When you're in a kitchen, if you drop the camera down, all of a sudden, instead of seeing the walls, it sees the cabinets, and the cabinets are very different from the walls. So that means it might get extremely confused. All that's required is that you just raise the camera back up. That's why you should keep the camera at a pretty consistent level while you're doing the auto map mode, and try not to spin around too fast. My suggestion would be to skip the auto map completely, which I think you even mentioned. Yep. In the future, auto map mode is really cool and it's really fun to use, but at the end of the day, it's, if it takes you 15 minutes, for example, to use the auto map, and I know some people don't use it this way, there's another way to use it, but if you do the auto map first and you walk around the property and then you go back and you fill in the panos, well, that's 15 minutes you didn't need to spend because the drafters are going to throw that data away anyway. There's no images associated with that data, so they can't use it for drafting. And then I think I even mentioned this on the last podcast, but I'll say it again. The images are important because the drafters need to identify what's structure and what's not so that they can draw around things like bookshelves and plants and just draw the floor plan as opposed to objects within the home. If that makes any sense? So if you skip the auto map, the drafters are getting exactly what they need and nothing else. Okay, I think that's it. I think we're good. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. That was awesome. Have a great rest of your day. Please fill out the survey. Really appreciate it. And I will be posting the recording of this on the forum the next few days. Cheers. Have a great day.
Happy Easter.